The defense attorney was mid-sentence when Lucy Worrell exploded into motion. Sitting in the front row of the federal courthouse, the 6-year-old deaf girl had been fighting to stay invisible, to keep the terrible secrets that she believed were keeping her 3 friends alive. But when Shadow walked into that courtroom, the same German shepherd who had found her in that nightmare basement, everything changed. Lucy's hands began to move with a desperation that caught the trained eye of interpreter Carmen Rodriguez. These weren't the random gestures of a nervous child. These were words, urgent, specific, life-saving words. "Stop!" Rodriguez called out, rising from her chair and causing every head in the courtroom to turn. "The child is trying to communicate something important." Judge Harrison had seen everything in his 30 years on the bench, but he'd never seen a 6-year-old witness bring federal proceedings to a halt with sign language. Lucy's small hands painted pictures of hidden rooms, secret entrances, and 3 children whose names she spelled out with crystal clarity: Maria, David, Tommy. Shadow began to pace, his professional demeanor cracking as Lucy, signing, triggered memories of scents and sounds from locations the police had never fully searched. The dog knew, the child knew, and time was running out. The morning mist clung to the windows of the Riverside County Courthouse like ghostly fingers, casting everything in shades of gray that seemed to seep into the very soul of the building. It was Monday, the kind of dreary October morning that made even the fluorescent lights inside seem dim and lifeless. The courthouse had seen thousands of cases over its 30-year history, but today felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. In courtroom 3B, the wooden pews stretched out in neat rows like church benches, their dark mahogany surfaces polished to a cold shine that reflected the overhead lights in harsh streaks. The American flag hung motionless in the corner, its red, white, and blue colors muted in the artificial lighting. Behind the judge bench, Lady Justice stood, frozen in bronze, her scales perfectly balanced, her blindfold a symbol of impartiality that felt both comforting and terrifying in the morning stillness. 6-year-old Lucy Martinez sat in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing courtroom around her. Her legs, too short to reach the floor, swung nervously back and forth, her scuffed sneakers catching the light with each movement. In her tiny hands, she clutched a stuffed rabbit, once white but now a faded cream color from countless nights of desperate hugging. The rabbit's left ear was nearly worn through from being rubbed between her fingers during moments of fear, and one of its button eyes hung by a thread, giving it a lopsided, sympathetic expression that seemed to understand her terror. Mrs. Chen, her court-appointed guardian, sat beside her with the practiced composure of someone who had shepherded dozens of children through the legal system. At 53, Elena Chen had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a navy blazer that smelled faintly of lavender, a deliberate choice, knowing that familiar, comforting scents could help traumatized children feel safer. Her hand rested gently on the pew between herself and Lucy, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to invade the child's carefully guarded personal space. For Lucy, the world existed in perfect, terrifying silence. She had been born deaf, thrust into a hearing world that often forgot she existed. The courtroom was a symphony of vibrations. She felt through the wooden bench beneath her, the shuffling of papers, the muffled conversations between lawyers, the heavy footsteps of court officers. She read the world through visual cues that most people never noticed. The way Mrs. Chen's shoulders tensed when someone approached. The rapid blinking of the court reporter when testimony grew intense. The subtle shift in lighting as clouds moved across the windows. Lucy, dark eyes, wise beyond their 6 years, constantly scanned the room for threats and safety in equal measure. She had learned to survive by watching, by reading the micro-expressions that flashed across adult faces before they could be hidden. Fear looked like tightened jaw muscles. Anger showed in the flaring of nostrils. Lies revealed themselves in the quick dart of eyes toward the exit. In Lucy's silent world, these visual languages were as clear as spoken words, clearer even, because they couldn't be faked as easily. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open, and Lucy's body immediately went rigid. The vibrations of approaching footsteps traveled through the floor and into her bones, and she knew without looking that Marcus Wilde was being brought in. The sound of chains clinking together was something she felt rather than heard, a metallic rhythm that made her stomach clench with remembered fear. Marcus Wilde shuffled into view, his hands cuffed in front of him, connected to a chain around his waist that linked to shackles around his ankles. He was a thin man in his 40s, with greasy brown hair that hung in strings around his gaunt face. His eyes, when they briefly met Lucy across the courtroom, were the same cold gray as the morning outside, empty, calculating, devoid of any warmth or humanity. Lucy's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened until her knuckles turned white, and she pressed herself deeper into the hard wooden bench, trying to become invisible. Mrs. Chen noticed immediately. Without crisp suits, carrying boxes of evidence and thick folders stuffed with documents. District Attorney Rebecca Morrison led the group, her silver hair pulled back in a professional bun, her expressions set in the determined lines of someone who had spent 20 years putting criminals behind bars. Her assistants moved with the efficient urgency of people who knew they were fighting for justice, not just winning cases. The defense attorneys entered with less fanfare but equal purpose. They moved like men carrying a heavy burden, their shoulders set in the resigned posture of lawyers who knew their client's guilt, but were bound by ethics and the Constitution to provide the best defense possible. Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers precisely at 9 o'clock, his black robes flowing behind him like wings. At 62, he had the distinguished bearing of a man who had seen every type of criminal and victim the justice system could produce. His reputation preceded him, tough but fair, uncompromising with criminals but infinitely patient with victims. His steel-gray hair was perfectly combed, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the weight of thousands of decisions that had changed lives forever. As the judge settled into his chair and the courtroom came to order, Lucy felt the familiar sensation of being invisible. In her world of silence, surrounded by people who communicated in ways she couldn't fully access, she often felt like a ghost haunting the edges of important events. The lawyers would speak in rapid bursts she couldn't follow. The judge would make pronouncements she could only partially understand through the court interpreter who had been assigned to translate the proceedings for her. Though Lucy had learned that interpreters often simplified complex legal language, leaving her with fragments of understanding rather than complete comprehension. She understood enough to know that this day was about the man in chains, the man who had taken her from everything safe and familiar and thrust her into a nightmare that still visited her dreams. She understood that these serious adults in their formal clothes were here to decide what would happen to him, and by extension, what would happen to her. But in the broader scope of justice and legal procedure, Lucy often felt like a footnote in her own story, present but not truly heard, seen but not truly understood. The stuffed rabbit in her arms seemed to sense her distress. Lucy pressed her face against its worn fur and inhaled the familiar smell of home and safety, trying to anchor herself to something real and comforting in a world that felt increasingly unreal and frightening. The heavy courtroom doors opened again, and this time the energy in the room shifted palpably. Even in her world of silence, Lucy could sense the change, a quickening of heartbeats, a straightening of spines, an almost electric. Bennett stepped through the doorway first, her uniform crisp and professional, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. At 34, she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had spent 8 years in law enforcement. But there was a gentleness in her brown eyes that spoke of genuine compassion for victims and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her hand rested lightly on the leather leash that connected her to her partner. And what a partner he was. Shadow emerged beside Officer Bennett like something from a storybook, a magnificent German shepherd whose very presence commanded respect and attention. At 4 years old, he was in the prime of his career and his life, standing 25 inches at the shoulder with the powerful build of a dog bred for both intelligence and action. His coat was a stunning combination of rich black and warm tan, the colors flowing together in patterns that seemed almost artistic in their perfection. His ears stood alert and perfectly triangular, constantly moving as he processed sounds and information that the humans around him couldn't even perceive. But it was Shadow's eyes that truly set him apart. They were the color of amber honey, flecked with gold and warm brown, and they held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and understanding. These were eyes that had seen into dark places and emerged with their kindness intact, eyes that had witnessed human cruelty but hadn't allowed it to dim their natural compassion. Shadow's training had begun when he was barely more than a puppy, selected from a litter of exceptional German shepherds for his unique combination of intelligence, drive, and temperament. He had spent 2 years learning the complex skills that would make him invaluable to law enforcement: scent detection that could identify drugs, explosives, and human remains from impossible distances, search and rescue techniques that had already saved 17 lives in his relatively short career, evidence recovery that had helped solve dozens of cases, and the specialized crowd control and protection work that made him an ideal courthouse companion. But beyond his impressive technical skills, Shadow possessed something that couldn't be taught or trained: an innate ability to sense human emotion and respond appropriately. He could distinguish between the nervous energy of an innocent witness and the aggressive tension of someone harboring dangerous intentions. He could identify fear, pain, and trauma in ways that even experienced officers sometimes missed. It was this sixth sense that made him particularly valuable in cases involving children, where traditional communication might be limited or impossible. As Shadow entered the courtroom, his amber eyes swept the space with professional efficiency, cataloging faces, assessing threats, noting the positions of all the humans under his protection. His training kept him focused and alert, but there was something else at work, as well, a deeper instinct that told him this case was different. This courtroom held secrets that needed to be uncovered. And then his eyes met Lucy. The connection was instantaneous and electric. Across the 30 feet of courtroom space, past the lawyers and court officers and gallery of observers, Shadow gaze locked with that of the small, frightened girl in the front row. In that moment, something profound passed between them, a recognition that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental connection between all living beings who have known fear and emerged with their capacity for trust intact. Lucy felt her heart skip a beat. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she experienced something other than fear or numbness. Shadow's presence seemed to fill the courtroom with a warmth that had been missing, a sense of safety that she hadn't felt in months. His calm, steady energy was the opposite of the chaotic, frightening adult world that swirled around her. Where the humans in the room moved with sharp, nervous energy, Shadow moved with fluid grace. Where their faces showed tension and anxiety, his expression radiated calm strength. Lucy's grip on her stuffed rabbit loosened slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid since Marcus Wilde's entrance, began to slow and deepen. For the first time all morning, she felt her shoulders relax, dropping from their hunched position near her ears to a more natural, less defensive posture. Mrs. Chen noticed the change immediately. She had worked with traumatized children long enough to recognize the signs of someone beginning to feel safe, and she followed Lucy's gaze to understand what had caused this shift. When she saw the magnificent German Shepherd standing at attention beside Officer Bennett, she nodded slightly in understanding. Animals had a way of reaching children that humans sometimes couldn't, especially children who had been hurt by the adult world. Shadow, meanwhile, was acutely aware of Lucy's attention. His professional training kept him positioned correctly beside Officer Bennett, his posture alert and ready, but part of his consciousness remained focused on the small girl, whose emotional state he could sense as clearly as if she were broadcasting her feelings on a radio frequency only he could receive. He could smell her fear. Yes, fear had a distinct scent, sharp and metallic. But underneath it, he detected something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope. The prosecutor, District Attorney Morrison, approached the bench to address Judge Harrison. Her voice carried clearly through the courtroom, though Lucy could only catch fragments through lip reading and the occasional sign from the court interpreter. Your Honor, we'd like to present testimony regarding the evidence discovery that led to the defendant's arrest. Officer Bennett and her K-9 partner Shadow were instrumental in locating crucial evidence at the defendant's property. Judge Harrison nodded, his expression serious. Officer Bennett, please approach the witness stand. As Officer Bennett made her way toward the front of the courtroom, Shadow moved with her, his gait smooth and professional. They had been partners for 3 years, and their synchronization was perfect, not just the result of training, but of genuine mutual respect and affection. Officer Bennett trusted Shadow's instincts completely, and Shadow responded to her guidance with unwavering loyalty. Officer Bennett, the prosecutor began once she had been sworn in, please tell the court about your partner's qualifications and training. Shadow is a 4-year-old German Shepherd who completed advanced training in multiple specializations, Officer Bennett replied, her voice clear and confident. He's certified in drug detection, explosive detection, search and rescue operations, and evidence recovery. He's been my partner for 3 years, and in that time, he's assisted in the successful resolution of over 60 cases. As the testimony continued, Lucy found herself captivated, not by the words she could barely follow, but by Shadow's presence. He stood at perfect attention beside the witness stand, but Lucy could see that his awareness extended far beyond his immediate surroundings. Occasionally, his amber eyes would find hers across the courtroom, and each time, she felt a little bit of the ice around her heart begin to melt. Shadow could sense the child's fascination with him, and something in his well-trained heart responded. He had worked with many traumatized individuals over his career, but there was something about this small, silent girl that called to him on a deeper level. Perhaps it was the way she communicated without words, using only her expressive dark eyes and subtle body language. Perhaps it was the recognition of a fellow being who had learned to navigate a world that didn't always understand them. Shadow's work at the defendant's property was instrumental in locating physical evidence that directly links Mr. Wilde to the charges against him, Officer Bennett continued. His scent detection capabilities led us to items that had been hidden in locations that would have been nearly impossible for human investigators to find. As the testimony progressed, Lucy felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of protection that didn't depend on hiding or making herself invisible. Shadow's presence in the courtroom seemed to create a bubble of safety around her, a space where she could begin to breathe normally and think clearly for the first time since this nightmare began. For the first time since entering the courthouse that morning, Lucy Martinez felt like she might actually be safe. As the prosecutor's questions about Shadow's evidence discovery continued, something unexpected began to happen in Lucy's mind. The sight of the magnificent German shepherd, standing alert and professional beside Officer Bennett, triggered memories that had been locked away in the deepest, darkest corners of her consciousness. Memories she had fought desperately to forget. The courtroom around her began to fade, its sterile fluorescent lighting giving way to something much darker and more terrifying. Lucy's small hands gripped her stuffed rabbit tighter as her mind involuntarily transported her back to that awful place, that basement that still haunted her dreams, and made her wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She was back in the darkness again, the suffocating, complete darkness of the underground room where she and the other children had been kept. The basement had been carved out of concrete and earth, its walls sweating with moisture that created a constant, oppressive humidity. The smell hit her memory like a physical blow, mold and dampness, fear and unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of terror that seemed to permeate everything in that horrible place. In her mind, Lucy could see the other children again, huddled together on thin, filthy mattresses scattered across the concrete floor. Maria, 7 years old, with tangled dark hair and huge brown eyes that seemed too old for her face. David, 8, who had tried so hard to be brave for the younger ones, his thin shoulders carrying a responsibility no child should bear. And Tommy, barely 5, who had cried silently for his mother until exhaustion finally claimed him each night. They had learned to communicate in whispers and gestures, creating their own desperate language of survival. Lucy, with her sign language skills, had become their translator, helping them share information about their captors' routines, warning each other when footsteps approached from above, organizing their meager resources and comfort in ways that helped them all survive another day. But it was the sound that haunted her most, or rather, the vibrations she had felt through her bones, the heavy footsteps above their heads that announced the arrival of their captors, the metallic scraping of the basement door being unlocked, the terrible silence that followed, broken only by the muffled sobs of whichever child had been chosen for that day as horror. And then, on that miraculous day when everything changed, there had been different sounds, vibrations that felt urgent and purposeful rather than threatening. Lucy remembered pressing her ear to the concrete floor, trying to understand what was happening above. The vibrations were different, multiple sets of footsteps moving quickly, voices raised, not in anger, but in what seemed like organized urgency. And then she had heard it, or rather, felt it, the deep, resonant barking of a large dog, the sound traveling through the building structure and into her bones like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. The barking was insistent, determined, growing closer and more urgent with each passing moment. Lucy's memory crystallized around that moment when the basement door had burst open, flooding their prison with blinding light. Silhouetted against that brilliant rectangle of hope had been the figures of police officers, their uniforms and badges catching the light like symbols of salvation. And leading them, his nose to the ground and his powerful body moving with purpose and determination, had been a German shepherd whose amber eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Shadow. It had been Shadow who found them. Lucy remembered how his paws had sounded against the wooden stairs as he descended into their prison, not the threatening footsteps they had learned to fear, but something entirely different. His approach had been careful, almost gentle, as if he understood that the children huddled in the darkness had already endured more trauma than their young minds could process. She remembered how Shadow had approached each child individually, his nose working constantly as he assessed their condition, his tail wagging slightly in a gesture that seemed designed to offer comfort rather than celebration. When he had reached Lucy, crouched in the farthest corner, with her arms wrapped around Tommy's shaking form, Shadow had lowered himself to the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening. Their eyes had met then, just as they had met again today in the courtroom, and Lucy had seen something in Shadow's amber gaze that she had almost forgotten existed: unconditional kindness, the promise of protection, the assurance that someone cared whether she lived or died. Back in the present, Lucy's breathing had become rapid and shallow again. But this time, it wasn't entirely from fear. The memories were painful, yes, but they also contained something else. The moment when everything began to change, when the nightmare started to end, and the possibility of safety entered her world again. Ms. Rodriguez, the ASL interpreter assigned to translate the court proceedings for Lucy, noticed the child's agitation. Lucy's small hands had begun moving almost unconsciously, forming fragments of signs that seemed to have no connection to the testimony being given. At first, Ms. Rodriguez assumed it was nervous behavior. Traumatized children often engaged in repetitive movements as a way of self-soothing. But as she watched more carefully, she began to recognize actual sign language in Lucy's movements. The signs were fragmented and scattered, but they formed words: dark, scared, other children, basement, help. Ms. Rodriguez frowned, trying to understand what Lucy was attempting to communicate. Meanwhile, Shadow's professional attention to the courtroom proceedings was being tested by his growing awareness of Lucy's distress. His training told him to remain focused on his handler and the immediate environment, watching for threats and maintaining his alert posture. But his deeper instincts, the ones that had made him such an exceptional police dog, were a sharp spike of adrenaline that came with traumatic memories, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the complex mix of fear and relief that came with remembering both trauma and rescue. Shadow's amber eyes found Lucy's across the courtroom once again, and this time he held her gaze with deliberate intention. In his expression, Lucy saw the same gentle strength that had given her hope in that terrible basement, the same promise of protection that had helped her survive the rescue and everything that followed. As the prosecutor continued her questioning about the evidence discovery, Lucy felt the memories becoming clearer and more insistent. She remembered details that she had buried deep in her mind, not just about her own rescue, but about the other children, about the things she had seen and heard during their captivity, about the complex network of adults and locations that had kept them prisoner. And suddenly, with a clarity that surprised her, Lucy realized that she knew things, important things, things that could help other children who might still be trapped in the darkness she had escaped. Her small hands began moving more deliberately now, forming signs that were no longer fragments but complete thoughts, urgent communications that needed to be heard and understood. She signed about the other children, about the places they had been kept, about the adults who had hurt them. But most of the courtroom was focused on Officer Bennett's testimony, and those who noticed Lucy signing assumed it was nervous behavior rather than desperate communication. Only Miss Rodriguez watched with growing concern as she began to understand that Lucy was trying to tell them something crucial. Shadow, however, seemed to understand on a level that transcended language. His posture remained professional, but his attention was increasingly divided between his official duties and the small girl whose distress he could sense as clearly as if she were calling his name. Lucy's hands formed one more sign, a simple gesture that she repeated over and over, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would understand. It was a sign she had learned during her captivity, a plea she had made countless times in the darkness of that terrible basement. The sign for help. But in the formal proceedings of the courtroom, with lawyers speaking and evidence being presented, Lucy's silent plea went unnoticed by most. She was once again the invisible child, the victim whose voice couldn't be heard above the complex machinery of the legal system. Except for shadow. Across the courtroom, the magnificent German shepherd's amber eyes held hers with unwavering attention, and in that gaze Lucy saw something that gave her the courage to keep trying, to keep signing, to keep fighting to be heard. Because Shadow knew. Somehow, he knew that she had something important to say, and maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. Lucy's small hands began moving with purpose, her fingers forming shapes and gestures that had meaning beyond the nervous fidgeting that court officials might expect from a traumatized child. What had started as unconscious fragments of memory was becoming deliberate communication, driven by an urgency that seemed to build with each passing moment. Ms. Carmen Rodriguez had been working as an ASL interpreter in the legal system for 12 years, and in that time, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between meaningful sign language and random hand movements. As she watched Lucy from her position near the front of the courtroom, her trained eye began to catch actual words, emerging from what others might dismiss as childish anxiety. The signs were initially hesitant, formed by small hands that trembled slightly with emotion, but they were unmistakably intentional. Lucy signed, "Remember," followed by "basement," then "children," and "scared." Her movements were precise despite their obvious emotional weight, each gesture formed with the careful accuracy of someone who had learned sign language as their primary means of communication. Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward in her chair, her professional curiosity shifting rapidly toward genuine concern. She had interpreted for countless child witnesses over the years, but something about Lucy signing felt different, more urgent, more desperate. There was a story trying to emerge from those small, moving hands, and Ms. Rodriguez's instincts told her it was a story that needed to be heard. Mrs. Chen, ever attuned to Lucy's emotional state, noticed the change immediately. The child's posture had shifted from the defensive hunching she had maintained all morning to something more active, more engaged. Her dark eyes, which had been darting nervously around the courtroom, were now focused with laser intensity on her own hands as they formed signs with increasing speed and complexity. "Lucy," Mrs. Chen whispered gently, leaning closer to the child. "Are you trying to tell us something, sweetheart?" Lucy's eyes met Mrs. Chen briefly, and in that moment the guardian saw something that made her heart race, not fear, this time, but determination. Lucy nodded once, quickly, then returned her attention to her signing, her small hands moving with growing urgency as if she were racing against time itself. Court Clerk Martinez, a thin man in his 50s who prided himself on maintaining order during proceedings, noticed the disturbance from his position near the judge's bench. He frowned disapprovingly at what he perceived as disruptive behavior, making a note to speak with Mrs. Chen about keeping her charge under better control. "The child needs to remain quiet during testimony," he whispered to his assistant, loud enough for Mrs. Chen to hear. "This kind of nervous behavior is distracting to the proceedings." But Ms. Rodriguez was no longer convinced. The chair, trying to get a better view of Lucy Hand's, her own heart beginning to race, as she recognized more and more actual words emerging from the child's increasingly frantic gestures. Across the courtroom, Shadow's amber eyes remained fixed on Lucy, with an intensity that was beginning to affect his professional demeanor. His ears, which had been held at alert attention during Officer Bennett's testimony, began to twitch and move as he sensed the subtle but significant shift in the courtroom's energy. The magnificent German shepherd could smell the change in Lucy's emotional state, the sharp spike of adrenaline that came not just with fear but with desperate urgency. Shadow's training had taught him to remain focused on his immediate duties, to maintain his position and alertness regardless of distractions. But his deeper instincts, the ones that had made him such an exceptional police dog, were telling him that something crucial was happening. The small girl who had captured his attention was no longer just a frightened witness. She was trying to communicate something that his every instinct told him was vitally important. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight moving slightly forward, as if he were preparing to move toward Lucy. Officer Bennett, deeply focused on answering the prosecutor's questions about evidence collection procedures, didn't notice the subtle change in her partner's demeanor. But Shadow's increasing alertness was beginning to affect the atmosphere in the courtroom. Judge Harrison, with his 30 years of courtroom experience, possessed an almost preternatural ability to sense when something significant was happening in his courtroom, even when it occurred outside the formal proceedings. His steel-gray eyes, which had been focused on Officer Bennett's testimony, began to drift toward the front row, where Lucy sat with Mrs. Chen. The judge's attention was caught first by the interpreter's obvious agitation. Miss Rodriguez was leaning forward in her chair, her own hands beginning to move in small, unconscious gestures as she tried to follow Lucy's increasingly rapid signing. Judge Harrison had worked with Miss Rodriguez many times over the years, and he had never seen her display this level of concern during routine proceedings. "Miss Rodriguez," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the prosecutor questioning, causing a sudden silence in the courtroom. "Is there something that requires the court's attention?" Miss Rodriguez stood, her professional composure battling with her growing sense of urgency. "Your Honor, I believe the child witness may be trying to communicate something relevant to the proceedings. Her signing appears to contain specific information rather than random nervous behavior." The courtroom fell silent, all attention now focused on Lucy, who continued signing with increasing desperation, her small hands forming gesture after gesture, as if she were afraid that stopping might mean losing her chance to be heard forever. Defense attorney Michael Brennan, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s, who had built his career on finding procedural weaknesses in the prosecution's case, immediately sensed an opportunity. "Your Honor, this appears to be an attempt to introduce unscheduled and unprepared testimony from a minor witness who has not been properly sworn in or subjected to appropriate psychological evaluation." But Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence, his experienced gaze moving from Lucy frantically signing hands to Miss Rodriguez's concerned expression, then to Mrs. Chen's protective posture beside the child. "Miss Rodriguez," the judge said carefully, "in your professional opinion, is the child attempting to communicate information that may be relevant to these proceedings?" Miss Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "Yes, Your Honor. She's signing about children, basements, being scared, and—" She paused, trying to catch more of Lucy's rapid gestures. "About remembering things, and she keeps signing something about the dog, about Shadow knowing something." A murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Judge Harrison's expression grew grave as he considered the implications. In his 30 years on the bench, he had learned to trust his instincts about when something truly important was happening. And every instinct he possessed was telling him that this moment could be crucial. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm going to ask you to approach the bench along with counsel from both sides. Mrs. Chen, please bring Lucy forward as well, but ensure she feels safe and supported." As the group gathered before the judge's bench, Lucy's signing became even more frantic. She could sense the shift in attention, the growing understanding that she was finally being heard, and the urgency of everything she needed to communicate threatened to overwhelm her small frame. Miss Rodriguez positioned herself where she could clearly see Lucy's hands, her trained eyes tracking every gesture as she prepared to serve as the bridge between Lucy's silent world and the hearing world of the courtroom. For the first time since the nightmare began, Lucy Martinez was about to truly be heard. Lucy's small hands moved with sudden, startling clarity, her fingers forming signs with a precision that cut through all the legal confusion and procedural uncertainty like a knife through silk. Her dark eyes, wide with the urgency of finally being heard, locked onto Miss Rodriguez's face as she signed the words that would change everything. "The dog knows about the other children." Miss Rodriguez's voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom as she translated Lucy's words. The simple sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap, its implications rippling outward through every person present. What had begun as a routine evidence hearing had just become something entirely different, something that none of them had been prepared for. Lucy's hands continued moving, each gesture deliberate and urgent. Her small fingers, which had seemed so fragile moments before, now moved with the strength of desperate truth. She signed "Shadow" with a gesture toward the magnificent German shepherd, then "Saw" and "Nose" and "Basement" and "Children crying." "She's saying that Shadow saw other children," Ms. Rodriguez translated, her own voice growing tighter with emotion. "That he knows about them, that there are others who were crying in the basement." The courtroom had fallen into the kind of absolute silence that occurs only in moments of profound revelation. Lawyers stopped shuffling papers, court officers ceased their quiet movements, and even the usual background hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to pause, as everyone present absorbed the weight of what they were hearing. Lucy's signing became more animated, her small body leaning forward as if the force of her communication could bridge the gap between her silent world and theirs. Her hands shaped words with increasing speed: scared, hiding, still there, need help. Each sign was formed with the careful precision of someone who had learned that being misunderstood could mean the difference between life and death. Ms. Rodriguez found herself leaning forward as well, her trained interpreter's mind working frantically to keep pace with Lucy's accelerating signs. "She is saying they're still scared, still hiding, that they still need help," she translated, her professional composure beginning to crack under the emotional weight of what she was conveying. Shadow, from his position beside Officer Bennett, had become visibly agitated. The magnificent German shepherd's amber eyes were fixed on Lucy with an intensity that transcended his professional training. His ears were pricked forward at full attention, and a soft whine escaped his throat, a sound of recognition and distress that seemed to confirm everything Lucy was signing. The dog's reaction sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Officer Bennett, momentarily forgetting the formal proceedings, reached down to steady her partner. "Easy, Shadow," she whispered, but she could feel the tension in his powerful frame, the way his muscles were coiled as if he were preparing to spring into action. Shadow pulled slightly against his leash, not with the aggressive energy that would signal a threat, but with something more complex, a desperate urgency that seemed to mirror Lucy's own. His whine grew slightly louder, and his amber eyes moved between Lucy and the exit doors as if he were trying to communicate his own version of her message. There were others who needed help, and they needed to find them now. Defense Attorney Brennan shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. We have an unsworn minor witness making unsubstantiated claims, coached by an interpreter, with no..." Could see his carefully constructed defense strategy crumbling before his eyes. Furthermore, the prosecution is clearly using this child's obvious trauma, and the emotional manipulation of having a police dog present to prejudice these proceedings. But Judge Harrison's experienced eyes were focused not on the lawyer objections, but on the small girl, whose hands continued to move with desperate urgency, and on the police dog, whose behavior seemed to corroborate her every gesture. He had presided over thousands of cases in his career, and he had developed an instinct for distinguishing between genuine revelation and courtroom theatrics. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench, "I understand your concerns about procedure. However, if this child has information that could prevent harm to other potential victims, this court has a moral and legal obligation to hear what she has to say." The judge's steel gray eyes moved to Lucy, who had paused in her signing, to look directly at him. In her young face, he saw something that decided him, not manipulation or coaching, but the raw, desperate honesty of a child who had survived something unthinkable and was now trying to save others from the same fate. "Miss Rodriguez, please continue interpreting for Lucy. Mrs. Chen, please ensure the child feels safe and supported. And Officer Bennett, I notice your canine partner seems to be responding to this testimony in an unusual manner." Officer Bennett nodded, her own face pale with growing understanding. "Yes, Your Honor. Shadow behavior suggests he recognizes or remembers something significant about what Lucy is describing. His training includes search and rescue operations, and he often shows this kind of agitation when he detects, scents, or situations related to previous cases." District Attorney Morrison stepped forward, her prosecutorial instincts recognizing the crucial nature of this moment. "Your Honor, I request permission to have Lucy's statements officially recorded. If there are other children at risk, every minute could be critical." Lucy, sensing the shift in the courtroom's energy, the growing understanding that she was finally being heard and believed, found a reservoir of courage she didn't know she possessed. Her signing became more confident, more detailed, as she began to describe what she had seen and experienced. Her small hands formed signs that painted vivid pictures. 3 children, she signed. Maria, David, Tommy. She indicated their approximate sizes with gestures, showed their ages with her finger, her eyes bright with tears, but also with determination. She signed rapidly about the basement, about the different rooms, about how the children had been moved between locations. Her gestures became more frantic as she described the fear in the other children's eyes, the way Tommy had cried for his mother, the way David had tried to be brave for the younger ones. The emotional weight of her testimony was hitting everyone in the courtroom like physical blows. Several jury members were openly crying. Mrs. Chen was struggling to maintain her composure, and even the bailiffs were visibly affected by the small girl's desperate communication. Shadow's whining had become more pronounced, and he was now pulling more insistently toward Lucy, his every instinct telling him that immediate action was required. His amber eyes moved between Lucy and Officer Bennett, as if he were trying to communicate his own urgent message. "We know where to look. We need to go now. There are children who need help." Lucy's hands formed one final crucial sign that made Ms. Rodriguez gasp aloud. "Still alive." "She's saying they're still alive," the interpreter translated, her voice breaking slightly. "The other children are still alive." The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as the full implications of Lucy's revelation hit home. This was no longer just a trial about one man's crimes against one child. It was, potentially, a rescue situation involving multiple victims who might still be in danger. Judge Harrison's gavel came down hard, but his voice remained calm and authoritative. This court is in recess while we address this emergency situation. Officer Bennett, I want you and Shadow prepared to assist in any search operations that may be necessary. Miss Rodriguez, please continue working with Lucy to document every detail she can provide. Lucy's small chest heaved with exhaustion and emotion, but her hands continued to move, driven by the desperate knowledge that somewhere out there, 3 other children were still trapped in the darkness she had escaped, still waiting for someone to find them, still hoping that help would come. And finally, after months of silence, someone was listening. Lucy's hands trembled as she began to sign more specific details, her small fingers working through memories that she had buried so deep that bringing them to the surface felt like clawing her way out of a grave. Each gesture seemed to cost her tremendous effort, but the desperate knowledge that Maria, David, and Tommy were still out there drove her forward with relentless determination. Maria, Lucy signed, her hands shaping the name with careful precision before moving to describe the 7-year-old girl's appearance. Her signs painted a vivid picture. Long, dark hair that had been tangled and dirty, brown eyes that were too large for her thin face, a small scar on her left hand from where she had cut herself trying to escape from zip-tie restraints. Miss Rodriguez's voice grew, increasingly strained as she translated each heartbreaking detail. She's describing Maria as 7 years old, very thin, with a scar on her left hand. Lucy is saying that Maria was always hungry and that she used to hum quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening. Lucy's signing became more animated as she described David, the 8-year-old boy who had appointed himself protector of the younger children. Her hands showed his height taller than the others and his distinctive red hair that had been cut short and unevenly, probably by their captors. She signed about his freckles, about the way he had tried to make games out of their horrible situation to keep the younger children from completely breaking down. David was 8, Ms. Rodriguez translated, struggling to keep her voice steady. Red hair, freckles, and Lucy is saying he was very brave. He used to tell the others stories to keep them from being too scared. But it was when Lucy began to describe Tommy that her composure finally started to crack. The 5-year-old had been the youngest, the most vulnerable, and Lucy's signs revealed a special bond she had felt with him. Her small hands shook as she described his blonde hair, his blue eyes that were often swollen from crying, the way he had curled up against her for comfort during the long, terrifying nights in the basement. Lucy's signing became more frantic as she relived the trauma of their separation. Her hands moved rapidly, desperately, as she described the morning when she had been taken away from the others. She had thought it meant she was going to be killed, but instead it had led to her rescue, while the others remained trapped. She's saying that Tommy is only 5 years old, Ms. Rodriguez translated, her own tears now flowing freely, blonde hair, blue eyes, and he was the most scared. She's describing how they were separated on the day of her rescue, how she thought she would never see them again. Shadow's response to Lucy's increasing distress was becoming impossible to ignore. The magnificent German shepherd was whining continuously now, his powerful body trembling with the effort of restraining his instinct to comfort the obviously traumatized child. His amber eyes moved between Lucy and Officer Bennett, and his behavior suggested recognition, as if Lucy's descriptions were triggering his own memories of the scents and sounds he had encountered during the original search. Officer Bennett placed a steadying hand on Shadow's head, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way his entire body was coiled for action. "Easy, boy," she whispered, but she could see that her partner was fighting every— "A request that we get Lucy's descriptions to our sketch artists immediately. We also need to coordinate with missing children databases to see if any of these descriptions match reported disappearances." Lucy suddenly stopped signing, her small hands frozen in mid-gesture as she looked across the courtroom at Marcus Wilde. The defendant had been growing increasingly agitated as Lucy's revelations unfolded, and now his face had gone completely white. His hands cuffed in front of him were clenched into fists, and his gray eyes held a panic that confirmed everything Lucy was saying more clearly than any evidence could. Mrs. Chen noticed Lucy's sudden stillness and followed her gaze to the defendant. What she saw there made her blood run cold, not just fear of being caught, but the specific terror of someone whose carefully constructed web of crimes was being unraveled by the one victim who had escaped to tell the truth. "Lucy, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen said gently, positioning herself slightly between the child and the defendant. "You're being so brave. Can you tell us anything else that might help find Maria, David, and Tommy?" Lucy's hands began to move again, but now her signing was different, more urgent, more desperate. She was describing locations, using gestures to indicate directions and distances. Her small fingers painted pictures of different basements, different houses, different hiding places where the children might be kept. Miss Rodriguez leaned closer, trying to catch every detail. "She's describing multiple locations," the interpreter said urgently. "Different houses, different basements. She's saying the children were moved around, never kept in the same place for very long." Lucy's signing became increasingly frantic as she described the system of movement that their captors had used. How children would be relocated every few days, transported in windowless vans, moved between different properties, in what she now understood had been a carefully organized network designed to avoid detection. Shadow's agitation reached a crescendo. The German Shepherd was now pulling actively against his leash, his whines becoming more insistent. His behavior suggested that Lucy's descriptions were triggering. Her next signs were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of everything she had endured. "They're still there," Miss Rodriguez translated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Still hiding, still scared." The courtroom fell silent as the full weight of Lucy's words settled over everyone present. These weren't just memories of past trauma. They were potentially real-time descriptions of ongoing crimes, of children who were still trapped in the nightmare that Lucy had managed to escape. Marcus Wilde's composure finally cracked completely. His face contorted with rage and panic as he struggled against his restraints. "She's lying!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's just a damaged kid making up stories. There are no other children." But his very desperation served as confirmation of Lucy's truth. Judge Harrison's steel-gray eyes fixed on the defendant with cold fury. "Mr. Wilde, you will remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Lucy's final series of signs came slowly, each gesture weighted with the desperate hope that someone would finally act on the information she had carried alone for so long. Her small hands formed words that would haunt everyone present. "Please find them. They're so scared. They think no one is coming. Please don't let them think no one is coming." Miss Rodriguez could barely get the words out through her tears. As she finished translating Lucy's desperate plea, the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as law enforcement officers began making urgent phone calls, coordinating what would become the largest child rescue operation in the county's history. Lucy collapsed back against Mrs. Chen, emotionally and physically exhausted from finally sharing the burden she had carried alone for so long. But for the first time since her rescue, there was hope in her dark eyes, hope that her courage might save 3 other children from the nightmare they were still living. The trial had become something much larger than justice for one victim. It had become a race against time to save 3 more. Lucy's small hands began to paint a map of horror with her precise, deliberate signs. Each gesture carved out a landscape of hidden places and secret rooms that existed in the shadows of their community, places where innocence had been stolen and childhood had been murdered, piece by piece. Her dark eyes, now clear with purpose despite their underlying pain, focused intently on Miss Rodriguez as she began to reveal the architectural blueprint of a nightmare. 2 houses, Lucy signed, her fingers forming the number with careful precision before moving to describe structures that had been burned into her memory through terror and survival. Connected underground, Miss Rodriguez's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as she translated each revelation. She's describing 2 separate houses that are connected by an underground tunnel or passage. Lucy's hands moved with increasing confidence as she described the first location. The basement, where she had been held initially, the one that Shadow and the police had already discovered. But then, her singing shifted to describe something else, something that made several law enforcement officers in the gallery straighten in their seats with sudden attention. Second basement, Lucy signed, her small fingers working through complex spatial descriptions. Behind the wall. Push 3 bricks. Click sound. Wall moves. The court stenographer, Martha Williams, who had been recording court proceedings for 15 years, found herself typing faster than she ever had before. Her fingers flew across the keys as she struggled to keep pace with Ms. Rodriguez's translations, knowing instinctively that every word could mean the difference between life and death for children who were still trapped. Lucy's description of the hidden entrance was remarkably detailed for a 6-year-old. Her signs showed exactly which bricks needed to be pressed, in what sequence, and how the false wall would pivot inward to reveal the passage beyond. She had obviously paid careful attention to her captor's movements, storing every detail in her young mind with the survival instinct of someone who knew that information meant the difference between escape and permanent captivity. She's describing a sophisticated concealment system, Ms. Rodriguez translated, her voice growing tighter with each detail. The wall appears solid, but opens with a specific sequence. Behind it is another basement, deeper, underground, where the other children are being kept. Shadow's agitation had reached a level that was impossible to ignore. The magnificent German shepherd was whining continuously now, his powerful body trembling with recognition and urgency. His amber eyes darted between Lucy and the courtroom exits, and his behavior suggested that her descriptions were triggering specific scent memories, memories of places he had been, traces he had detected during the original investigation. Officer Bennett felt the tension in her partner's frame through the leash connecting them. Shadow was pulling steadily toward Lucy now, not with aggression, but with the desperate urgency of a rescue dog who had detected survivors and was being prevented from reaching them. Lucy continued signing, her small hands now describing the children themselves with heartbreaking detail. Her gestures painted portraits of 3 young lives that had been trapped in darkness. Maria, with her gentle spirit broken by months of captivity. David, carrying the impossible burden of trying to protect the younger ones. And tiny Tommy, who had almost stopped speaking entirely, except to whisper for his mother. Maria used to braid my hair, Lucy signed, her movements becoming more emotional as she described the small kindnesses the children had shared with each other. She would hum songs her grandmother taught her, found herself struggling to maintain professional composure as she translated Lucy's description of how the children had created their own family unit in captivity.
Lucy is describing how they took care of each other. Maria would comfort the others by braiding their hair and singing softly. David would tell stories to distract them from their fear.
Lucy's hands shook slightly as she described David's attempts to keep their spirits up. He had been only 8 years old, but he had understood that despair would kill them faster than their captors ever could. He had invented games they could play in silence, created fantasy worlds they could escape to in their minds, and always made sure the younger ones ate first when food was provided.
David was like a big brother.
Ms. Rodriguez translated through her tears.
He would give his food to Tommy when the little one was too scared to eat. He made up stories about brave knights and princesses who always escaped from dark castles.
But it was Lucy's description of Tommy that broke hearts throughout the courtroom. The 5-year-old had been the most fragile, the most vulnerable, and Lucy's signs revealed the special, protective bond she had felt toward him.
Tommy stopped talking.
Lucy signed, her small hands moving slowly as she described the child's retreat into almost complete silence.
Only whispered "Mama" sometimes. He would curl up so small, trying to disappear. I would hold him at night when he cried without making a sound.
Law enforcement officers in the gallery were now openly making urgent phone calls, their voices low but intense as they coordinated what was rapidly becoming a major rescue operation. Detective Ray Martinez, who specialized in child trafficking cases, was already speaking with his captain about mobilizing search teams. FBI agent Sarah Kim was coordinating with federal task forces that dealt with multi-jurisdictional trafficking networks. Lucy suddenly stopped signing and looked directly at Shadow. The German shepherd's amber eyes met hers across the courtroom, and in that moment of connection, something profound passed between them. Shadow stopped pulling against his leash and instead began to whine in a different tone, not agitation now, but recognition, and what almost sounded like communication. Lucy's hands began to move again, but this time her signs were directed toward Shadow as much as toward the interpreter.
He smells them,
she signed, her dark eyes never leaving the dog's intelligent face.
He knows where they are. He remembers.
The courtroom fell silent as Ms. Rodriguez translated this extraordinary moment. She's saying that Shadow recognizes the sense she's describing, that he remembers encountering traces of these children during the original investigation. Officer Bennett leaned down toward her partner, studying his behavior with the keen eye of someone who had worked with him for 3 years. Shadow's body language was indeed suggesting recognition. His nose was working constantly, as if he were processing scent memories triggered by Lucy's descriptions. "Your Honor," Officer Bennett said, rising from her position near the witness stand. "Shadow's behavior strongly suggests that he encountered evidence of additional children during our original search of the defendant's property. It's possible we missed secondary locations because we weren't looking for them." Judge Harrison's steel-gray eyes moved between the agitated police dog, the signing child, and the growing chaos of law enforcement coordination happening in his courtroom gallery. His 30 years of experience told him they were witnessing something unprecedented. A child witness providing real-time intelligence about ongoing crimes, while a police dog essentially corroborated her testimony through behavioral response. Lucy's final signs in this sequence were the most crucial. Her small hands formed gestures that described not just where the children were, but how to find them, specific landmarks, distances from main roads, identifying features of the properties where they were being held. "Red mailbox," she signed, her fingers carefully forming each detail. "Blue house with broken porch step. Tree with initials carved in bark. Underground entrance behind the furnace in the basement." As Ms. Rodriguez translated these critical navigation details, the court stenographer's typing reached a fever pitch, and every law enforcement officer in the room was now either on the phone or taking urgent notes. Lucy's small chest heaved with exhaustion, but her eyes held a desperate hope that hadn't been there before. For the first time since her rescue, someone was not just listening to her. They were preparing to act on what she had to say. Shadow's whining had evolved into something that almost sounded like speech, a complex series of vocalizations that seemed to echo Lucy's urgency. The connection between the traumatized child and the police dog had become something that transcended normal communication. A shared understanding based on memories of fear, scent, and the desperate knowledge that time was running out for 3 children who were still trapped in the darkness. Lucy's hands began to move with renewed urgency as she delved deeper into the organizational structure of the nightmare she had escaped. Her signing revealed a level of sophistication that sent chills through every law enforcement officer present. This wasn't the work of a single predator, but rather a coordinated network that had been operating with careful planning and systematic precision. Many adults, Lucy signed, her small fingers counting out numbers that made Ms. Rodriguez's voice catch as she translated. 7, maybe 8 different people, different jobs for each one. The revelation hit the prosecution team like a physical blow. District Attorney Morrison felt her stomach prosecute Marcus Wilde for the crimes against Lucy. But Lucy's testimony was revealing a trafficking operation that potentially spanned multiple states and involved dozens of victims. Lucy's descriptions of the transportation system were particularly chilling. Her small hands painted vivid pictures of windowless vans with special compartments, vehicles that had been modified specifically for the purpose of moving children without detection. She described being transferred between locations in what amounted to mobile prisons, dark, confined spaces where children were kept drugged and silent during transport. White van, no windows in back, Lucy signed, her movements becoming more animated as she recalled specific details. Smells like chemicals, made us sleepy. Compartment under floor where they hid us when police cars drove by. Ms. Rodriguez's translation was punctuated by gasps from the gallery as the sophisticated nature of the operation became clear. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were organized, well-funded, and had been operating successfully for what must have been years. Lucy's next revelations about the communication methods used by the traffickers demonstrated an intelligence-gathering ability that was remarkable for a 6-year-old child. During her captivity, she had observed and memorized code words, hand signals, and communication patterns that her captors had assumed she couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. Package pickup meant moving children, Lucy signed, her young mind having decoded the clinical language her captors had used to dehumanize their victims. Clean house means hide evidence. Special delivery meant someone was buying. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Lucy's intelligence became clear. She had essentially conducted her own surveillance operation during her captivity, storing every piece of information that might someday help her escape or help others be rescued. Defense attorney Brennan was becoming increasingly desperate as he watched his client's case transform from a single count of child abuse into what was clearly going to become a massive federal trafficking investigation. His face had gone pale as Lucy's revelations made it clear that Marcus Wilde was not just a perpetrator, but a significant figure in a much larger criminal enterprise. "Your Honor," Brennan interrupted, his voice cracking with strain, This testimony is completely outside the scope of the charges against my client. This child has been coached to provide sensational accusations that have no bearing on the specific case we're here to try." But Judge Harrison silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Brennan, if your client is involved in an ongoing criminal enterprise that is currently endangering the lives of children in the original investigation." Her small hands moved carefully as she explained that the German Shepherd had actually detected evidence of the other children during his initial search of Marcus Wilde's property, but that evidence had been overlooked or misinterpreted. "Dog found scents," Lucy signed, her dark eyes fixed on Shadow's amber ones. 3 different child scents in the basement. Also found clothes buried in the yard. Small shirt, little shoes. But men didn't understand what the dog was trying to show them. Officer Bennett felt her heart sink as she realized the implications of Lucy's statement. Shadow had been trying to communicate additional discoveries during their original search, but she and the other investigators had been focused on collecting evidence for the charges they already knew about. They had missed the signs that could have led them to the other children months ago. The prosecution team was rapidly reassessing everything they thought they knew about the case. Assistant District Attorney James Wright was already on the phone with federal agencies, explaining that what they had believed to be a local child abuse case was actually a significant trafficking operation that required immediate federal intervention. Lucy's description of the network's scope continued to expand with each revelation. Her signing painted a picture of properties in multiple counties, safe houses where children were held temporarily, and a distribution system that moved victims across state lines with frightening efficiency. "Houses in 3 different places," Lucy signed, her small hands indicating directions and distances. "Big house by water where adults came to look at children. Warehouse where vans were kept. Farm where some children worked during day." The methodical nature of Lucy's testimony was what made it so credible and so terrifying. She wasn't making dramatic accusations or telling impossible stories. She was providing the kind of detailed, specific intelligence that could only come from first-hand experience and careful observation. Ms. Rodriguez found herself struggling to keep pace with Lucy's accelerating signs, as the child seemed to realize that this might be her only opportunity to share everything she had learned. "She's describing multiple facilities," the interpreter said urgently, "including locations where children were displayed to potential buyers, and others where they were forced to work." Shadow's behavior had evolved from agitation to what could only be described as active communication. The German Shepherd was now alternating between whining at Lucy and barking toward the courtroom exits, as if he were trying to tell everyone that they needed to stop talking and start searching. Judge Harrison made the decision that would transform the entire proceedings. "This court is hereby recessed to allow law enforcement agencies to investigate the claims made by this witness. Officer Bennett, I want you and Shadow prepared to assist in any search operations. Ms. Rodriguez, please work with investigators to document every detail Lucy has provided." Lucy's signing became more frantic as she realized that the formal proceedings were ending. Her small hands moved desperately as she tried to communicate one final, crucial piece of information. "Network bigger than they know," she signed, her eyes wide with urgent fear. "This man," she gestured toward Marcus Wilde, "just one piece. Other men, other children, other places. If they don't find all pieces, children will be moved, hidden where no one can find them." As Ms. Rodriguez translated this final warning, the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Law enforcement officers were coordinating multi-agency responses, federal agents were being briefed over secure phone lines, and emergency response teams were being mobilized, for what had become the largest child rescue operation in the state's history. Lucy collapsed back against Mrs. Chen, emotionally and physically drained from revealing secrets she had carried alone for months. But her work was far from over. She had just provided law enforcement with the intelligence they needed to potentially save not just Maria, David, and Tommy, but dozens of others. Children who were trapped in a network of horror that was far larger than anyone had imagined. Lucy's small body trembled as she prepared to reveal the darkest truth of all, the reason she had remained silent for so long, the threat that had kept her secrets locked away even after her rescue. Her hands moved slowly now, each sign weighted with the terrible knowledge that her silence might have cost other children their lives, but that speaking might have cost them their lives as well. They said, "If I ever told anyone about the others," Lucy signed, her dark eyes filling with tears that she had held back for months. "They would hurt Maria, David, and Tommy worse. They said they would know if I talked, and the other children would die because of my words." Ms. Rodriguez's voice broke as she translated Lucy's revelation. The courtroom fell silent as everyone present understood the impossible burden this 6-year-old child had been carrying, the weight of believing that her silence was the only thing keeping 3 other children alive. Mrs. Chen felt her heart shatter as she realized the depth of Lucy's psychological torture. The child had been living with the belief that speaking up to save herself meant condemning 3 other innocent children to death. It was a level of manipulation and cruelty that was almost beyond comprehension, designed specifically to ensure that even if one victim escaped, they would never be able to help rescue the others. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Chen whispered, her own tears flowing freely now. "You were just a little girl. You couldn't have known that staying silent wouldn't save them. You were trying to protect them, the only way you knew how." Lucy's signing became more emotional as she described the psychological manipulation that had been used to ensure her silence. Her captors had shown her photographs of what happened to children who talked to police, had made her watch as punishment was inflicted on other victims, had convinced her that she held the power of life and death over her fellow prisoners. "Showed me pictures," Lucy signed, her small hands shaking with remembered terror. "Children who talk to adults, bad things happened to them. Told me I was responsible if others got hurt because I couldn't keep secrets." The sophisticated nature of the psychological conditioning was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. These traffickers hadn't just used physical restraints to control their victims. They had used psychological warfare, turning the children's natural compassion and protective instincts against them. Shadow, who had been watching Lucy's emotional deterioration with growing concern, suddenly made a decision that went against every aspect of his professional training. The magnificent German shepherd rose from his position beside Officer Bennett. "Stop her. Let him approach," the judge said quietly. "This child needs all the comfort we can provide." Shadow's approach was unlike anything his handlers had ever seen from him. The powerful police dog, trained to be alert and professional at all times, lowered his head submissively as he drew near to Lucy. His amber eyes, usually sharp with professional focus, were soft, with an almost human understanding of pain and trauma. Lucy watched Shadow's approach with a mixture of fear and hope. She had been let down and betrayed by so many adults that, trusting anyone, even someone who had saved her, felt dangerous and impossible. But there was something about Shadow's gentle demeanor, something about the way he moved toward her without any sense of threat or demand, that spoke to a part of her heart that still remembered what safety felt like. "He's not like them," Lucy signed slowly, her eyes never leaving Shadow's face. He doesn't want to hurt anyone. He wants to help. Ms. Rodriguez translated Lucy's observation through her tears, and everyone in the courtroom could see the significance of this moment. For the first time since her rescue, Lucy was expressing trust in another being. The connection she was forming with Shadow represented a breakthrough that might be crucial not just for her healing, but for her ability to help save the other children. Shadow stopped just within arm's reach of Lucy and settled into a lying position, making himself as non-threatening as possible. His amber eyes remained fixed on her face, and he made a soft sound that was somewhere between a whine and a gentle vocalization, not distressed, but communicative, as if he were trying to tell her that she was safe, that he understood her pain, that he would protect her. Lucy's free hand, the one not clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, slowly extended toward Shadow. The gesture was tentative, fearful, but determined. Her small fingers stopped just inches from his head, trembling with the effort of overcoming months of learned fear and distrust. Mrs. Chen held her breath as she watched this crucial moment unfold. She had seen many traumatized children struggle to rebuild their ability to trust, and she understood that Lucy's willingness to reach toward Shadow represented a monumentally important step in her healing process. Shadow remained perfectly still, allowing Lucy to control the pace and extent of their interaction. His training had taught him to be gentle with victims, but something deeper, some instinct that went beyond professional instruction, told him that this moment was about more than comfort. This was about rebuilding a child's fundamental ability to believe that not all powerful beings in the world intended to cause harm. Lucy's fingers finally made contact with Shadow's head, and the gentle texture of his fur seemed to unlock something inside her that had been frozen since her captivity began. Her tears, which had been threatening to fall throughout, her testimony finally came. Not tears of fear or despair, but tears of relief and connection. "He remembers me," Lucy signed with her free hand, her other hand now resting confidently on Shadow's head. "He remembers finding us in the dark. He was so gentle then, too. He didn't bark or scare us more. He just let us know we were going to be okay." Shadow's response was to shift slightly closer to Lucy, always moving slowly and deliberately so as not to startle her. His amber eyes remained fixed on her face, and his tail moved in a gentle, subtle wag that spoke of contentment and protective affection. The emotional impact of this moment was affecting everyone in the courtroom. Hardened law enforcement officers were openly wiping their eyes, and even some of the court officials who had seen thousands of cases were struggling to maintain their composure. Lucy's final communication of this chapter came slowly, her small hands forming signs while her other hand remained connected to Shadow's reassuring presence. Her words carried the weight of months of silence and the hope of imminent action. "Please, find them," Lucy signed, her dark eyes moving between Ms. Rodriguez and Shadow's amber gaze. "Maria, David, and Tommy. They're so scared right now. They think no one remembers them. They think no one is coming to help." Her hands paused, then formed one final, heartbreaking plea. "Please, don't let them think no one is coming. Please, don't let them feel as alone as I felt." Ms. Rodriguez could barely speak as she translated Lucy's final request. The courtroom had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the soft sounds of people struggling to control their emotions and the gentle panting of a police dog who had somehow become the bridge between a traumatized child and the hope of saving 3 more. As law enforcement officers began coordinating the massive rescue operation that Lucy's courage had made possible. Shadow remained beside her, his presence a living promise that this time someone was indeed coming to help, and that no child would be left alone in the darkness. The race to save Maria, David, and Tommy had begun, guided by the extraordinary courage of a 6-year-old girl who had finally found the strength to break her silence, and aided by a German shepherd whose loyalty extended far beyond his professional duties, to encompass the fundamental calling to protect those who could not protect themselves. The courthouse erupted into controlled chaos the moment Lucy's testimony turned a single criminal trial into the county's largest rescue operation in decades. Every minute lost could cost a life. "We treat this like an active rescue," he told the room. 3 children, possible immediate danger. Rescue first, evidence second. From the back, FBI agent Sarah Kim stepped forward. "Everything about this screams organized trafficking. If we delay, the kids disappear or the trail goes cold." All eyes shifted to Officer Bennett and her German shepherd partner, Shadow. He'd been to the original crime scene. His scent memory could connect the dots faster than any map. Bennett checked his harness and scent aids, running through the silent hand signals they'd need. "If Lucy's right, some sites might be booby-trapped," she warned. "We're going in careful." Lucy sat nearby with paper and crayons, her small hands moving with deliberate focus as she sketched landmarks: a leaning red mailbox, a huge oak with a rope swing, a hidden house behind trees. Mrs. Chen stayed at her side, gently encouraging and interpreting each sign. A police sketch artist turned her rough drawings into precise images, transmitted instantly to field teams. Janet Walsh from Child Protective Services briefed the medics. "These kids might be terrified of law enforcement, and their injuries won't all be visible. Approach soft." "I'm staying with Lucy," Mrs. Chen told Judge Harrison. "She needs support, and she might remember more." Outside, news vans gathered, sensing something extraordinary inside. Detective Laura Thompson managed the press, offering just enough to satisfy public curiosity without jeopardizing the mission. Lucy's vivid descriptions had already made Maria, David, and Tommy real to every officer. Maria, who hummed lullabies; David, the storyteller; Tommy, who barely spoke except to call for his mother. Martinez knew time could mean the difference between reunion and tragedy. "3 children are counting on us," he reminded his teams. Shadow sat ready, amber eyes locked on Bennett. "This is what we trained for, boy," she whispered. The convoy rolled out like a military operation, each vehicle carrying specialists translating Lucy's sketches into movement. Shadow rode in the lead, scanning the streets. The first sight matched perfectly. The red mailbox, the oak with the swing, the gravel drive hidden by hedges. "That's it," Martinez radioed. "Blue house, broken porch step. Teams 2 and 3, perimeter. Team 1, K9 entry." Shadow's body tightened, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Bennett felt it through the harness. "He's recognizing scents from before," she reported. Agent Kim's voice from command was taut. "Then Lucy's right. Proceed." Shadow worked the perimeter with practiced precision, his movements deliberate, reading scents like a map. Bennett's eyes followed every shift of Alert. "Live scent, consistent with children in distress," Bennett radioed. "Basement level." Entry was swift but careful. The unlocked door matched Lucy's account. Inside, the sparse furnishings felt temporary. Shadow led the descent into the basement, bypassing stored boxes to press his nose against a solid wall. He whined in a pattern Bennett knew well: hidden entrance. 3 bricks, top left, Martinez recalled from Lucy's instructions. He pressed them and the wall swung inward, revealing a concealed chamber. Across the county, other teams reported in: an abandoned farm with traces of forced labor, a warehouse with modified transport vehicles, but no live victims. Here, though, Shadow's excitement spiked. The room beyond was larger than the basement itself, concrete reinforced, air stale with fear and neglect. Thin mattresses lined one wall. In the far corner, 2 small shapes huddled together, Maria and David. Maria's hair was matted, her small frame gaunt. David's thin arm shielded her despite his own weakness. Their eyes were wide with terror until they saw Shadow. "Shadow?" Maria's voice was a dry whisper. "You came back?" David's posture eased. "Is Lucy safe?" Bennett's voice cracked. "She's safe. She told us where to find you. She never stopped trying." Shadow lowered himself, moving forward slowly, tail sweeping in soft arcs of reassurance. Maria reached first, her trembling hand brushing his fur. Tears broke free, relief, not despair. David joined her. "He remembers us," David whispered. "He came back, like he came for Lucy." Paramedics moved in, careful and calm. Malnourished, dehydrated, traumatized, but alive. "You're going somewhere safe now," Bennett said. "Shadow will stay with you until you see Lucy." Maria's head lifted. "She didn't forget." "She never forgot," Martinez said. "You'll see her soon." Bennett keyed her radio. "Command, Team 1. 2 victims recovered alive. Maria Gonzalez, 7. David Patterson, 8. Stable but need immediate care." Cheers and rapid orders filled the airwaves. Medical helicopters inbound, psychologists on call. Back at the courthouse, Lucy was being prepared for the reunion. As Maria and David were carried out wrapped in blankets, David's voice rose with a child's impossible burden. "Where's Tommy? They moved him last week. He's so little, so scared." The reply carried both triumph and urgency. "2 safe, 1 still missing. Search continues." Shadow stayed close, amber eyes promising safety to the rescued, and determination for the one still lost. The radio transmission from Officer Bennett crackled through the courthouse command center, turning the once sterile legal setting into a tempered celebration. Lucy, sketching quietly beside Mrs. Chen, looked up sharply at the shift in voices. Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward, voice thick with "Maria and David, they're alive and safe." Relief flooded Lucy's dark eyes, tears spilling for the first time from joy rather than fear. Her hands flew in rapid sign language. "Really? Maria's okay? David's okay? They're not hurt?" Mrs. Chen pulled her close as the child's composure cracked. Months of carrying the terrible knowledge that her friends were still trapped had finally lifted, at least for 2 of them. But Lucy's joy quickly turned to frantic concern. "Where is Tommy? He's so little. He needs his blanket to sleep. Where did they take him?" Judge Harrison's courtroom had transformed into a humanitarian crisis hub. Maps, agents, child welfare workers, and officers coordinated with urgency. "This court will remain in emergency session until all children have been located," Harrison declared. Outside, the media swelled, but Mrs. Chen intervened. "Judge, Lucy must be shielded from public exposure while she helps us." He agreed, issuing protective orders. Lucy insisted she had more to share, memories she'd buried. She described a bigger place with many rooms, called a special location for special orders. The implications were chilling. Her sketches detailed Tommy's location, guards changing at night, a locked room, food once daily. The facility sounded industrial. 3 floors below ground, accessible only by keycard. It was no improvised hideout. It was purpose-built for criminal operations. Officer Bennett and Shadow, her German Shepherd partner, geared up for a search, unlike the earlier ones. Lucy's directions led them to an abandoned manufacturing plant in a desolate warehouse district. Multiple entry points, heavy modifications, perfect cover for trafficking. Inside, Shadow's nose worked furiously, processing the complex mix of scents: children, adults, chemicals. The upper floors revealed evidence of recent crimes, but no Tommy. As they descended, Shadow's focus sharpened. Fresh scent. The basement was a maze of low ceilings and stained concrete. Shadow's whines grew purposeful, pulling them deeper. Yet 60% through the sweep, still no Tommy. Bennett requested clearance to search any hidden levels. Approval came instantly. Shadow led them to a cramped utility room, his nose fixed on the floor near a maintenance panel. Detective Martinez's flashlight revealed newer concrete patches, evidence of concealed work. Trained to indicate without damage, Shadow scratched precisely. Beneath was a hidden hatch leading to a narrow tunnel. The sub-basement beyond was professionally built. Reinforced walls, separate power, filtered air, designed for total concealment. Shadow's urgency reached a fever pitch, dragging them to a reinforced steel-plated door with multiple locks. Martinez noted, "This is the most secure area. Whatever's inside, they value it highly." The team approached carefully, mindful that rescued children often feel. The final lock opened. They found a tiny figure curled on a filthy mattress. Tommy. Malnourished, dehydrated, his blonde hair matted, he clutched a scrap of blanket. He made no sound until he saw Shadow. "Shadow." His whisper was hoarse, but clear. Shadow came back. Bennett felt tears burn. For these children, Shadow wasn't just a police dog. He was hope itself. Tommy's condition was critical. Unlike Maria and David, he couldn't walk. Paramedics prepared for immediate hospital transport. As they carried him out, Shadow stayed beside the stretcher, nuzzling Tommy's hand. The radio back to the courthouse confirmed. Third victim recovered alive, critical condition, but responsive. All 3 children located. In court, Lucy signed urgent questions about Tommy's health. Mrs. Chen held her as the child absorbed the news. Her courage had saved them all. Shadow rode in the ambulance with Tommy, a living reassurance that the nightmare was over. The county's largest child rescue was complete, the trafficking network exposed. Lucy's silence had been broken. Her bravery, paired with Shadow's skill, had achieved what many thought impossible, proving again that the bond between humans and their 4-legged partners can accomplish miracles. The rescue of Tommy from the hidden sub-basement was the break law enforcement had been waiting for. Within hours, evidence from the facility revealed a trafficking network spanning 6 states, operating for 3 years and victimizing as many as 50 children. What began as charges against Marcus Wilde exploded into a federal investigation involving the FBI, U.S. Marshals, ICE, and multiple state agencies. FBI agent Sarah Kim led the largest multi-jurisdictional case of her career. Forensic teams processed computers, financial records, and communications, uncovering an operation run with corporate precision. Lucy's role proved vital. Her extraordinary memory for faces, voices, and details, shared through sign language with interpreter Ms. Rodriguez, identified suspects, vehicles, properties, and a money laundering system. Warrants were issued in 4 states. Wilde's plea negotiations faltered as the case widened. Judge Harrison, unmoved by Wilde's offer to implicate others, made clear that cooperation would not erase the gravity of his crimes. The courthouse became a command center. Specialists from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, digital forensics experts, and financial investigators worked around the clock. Mrs. Chen explained to Lucy in simple terms that her bravery had saved not just her 3 friends, Maria, David, and Tommy, but dozens more. Lucy, thinking only of others, asked anxiously if all the children were safe. Prosecutors prepared one of the largest child trafficking cases. Enterprise. Efficient, disciplined, and ruthless. At a secure hospital wing, Dr. Patricia Hendricks oversaw the children's recovery. Lucy's reunion with Maria and David was carefully planned. As Mrs. Chen led her down the corridor, Lucy signed questions. Would her friends be angry she'd been rescued first? Mrs. Chen reassured her. The moment the door opened, Maria's face lit with the first true smile since her rescue. "You came back for us," she whispered. Lucy ran to embrace her, tears flowing. David, voice trembling, said, "We knew you wouldn't forget." The three communicated in a mix of speech and signs, Lucy bridging the gap between hearing and deaf worlds. Lucy told them Tommy was alive, but still in another room. Ms. Rodriguez watched, moved by how naturally they navigated their differences. Later that day, Shadow, the German shepherd who had helped find them, entered the room with Officer Bennett. The children's joy was instant. "You brought everyone home," Maria said, burying her hands in his fur. David added, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Therapy for the children focused on both their individual traumas and their shared bond, which Dr. Hendricks considered a healing asset. Foster placements were being arranged, with Maria's grandmother under review, and David's case more complex due to the loss of his parents. Lucy's gift for switching between speech and sign made her an unofficial communication coordinator, helping staff understand the children's needs. Their reunion was more than personal. It was proof of the strength found in courage and friendship. The case, now dubbed the Silent Witness Case, drew national attention. Detective Laura Thompson, managing media requests, balanced public interest with protecting the children's privacy. Mrs. Chen, speaking for Lucy, emphasized her message. It's always okay to ask for help, even if told to keep secrets. The public responded with letters, drawings, and donations. Advocacy groups used Lucy's case to push for better interpreter services and training for law enforcement working with deaf children. Officer Bennett and Shadow's recognition opened discussions on K-9 units as bridges to communication and healing, not just detection tools. Attorney General Patricia Williams announced reviews of interpreter policies in several states. Lucy's growing comfort with her role came as she saw letters from other children inspired by her story. One drawing showed her and Shadow together. Shadow began specialized training for working with deaf children, his methods studied nationwide. The professionals who made Lucy's voice heard, Ms. Rodriguez, Dr. Sound, to transform lives. She had not only saved her friends, but dismantled a network and sparked reforms to protect children she would never meet. She understood now. Her choice to speak had created ripples far beyond the courthouse, ensuring safety for countless others in the years ahead. The federal grand jury's indictment stretched across 43 pages, charging Marcus Wilde with crimes far darker than the original assault allegation: human trafficking, racketeering, kidnapping across state lines, child sexual exploitation, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. 17 co-conspirators across 6 states now faced prosecution. U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams told the press, "This indictment represents one of the most comprehensive child trafficking prosecutions in federal history. The courage of one 6-year-old witness has exposed a criminal network operating with sophistication and cruelty that challenges our understanding of organized crime. That witness, Lucy, a deaf child rescued months earlier, required a team of psychologists, trauma therapists, child witness experts, and ASL specialists to prepare her for trial. Dr. Patricia Hendricks devised methods to let Lucy recount her experiences without re-traumatization. The court reconfigured the room so Lucy could see her interpreter, Ms. Rodriguez, and her therapy dog, Shadow, at all times. Judge Harrison even issued a precedent-setting order, allowing Shadow to remain throughout testimony. Defense attorney Brennan had little room to maneuver. The evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, was overwhelming. Still, he claimed others were the primary organizers. Lucy's confidence grew as rescues and arrests mounted. Mrs. Chen, her guardian, became the steadfast presence she'd never had before. "She's beginning to understand that her voice matters," Mrs. Chen observed. The day Lucy testified, she wore a simple blue dress. Her small frame looked fragile, but her gaze was steady. Through signs and occasional words, she described being moved in windowless vans, threats from captors, and how Maria, David, and Tommy coped. David telling stories, Maria braiding hair, Tommy whispering "Mama" in silence. Jurors openly wept. Brennan's cross-examination was constrained by court rules. "Could you be confused about some details?" he asked. Lucy's hands moved firmly. "I remember everything, because I had to. Remembering was the only way I could help." Her account aligned perfectly with evidence. Facility layouts, transport methods, even Wilde's deliberations lasted 2.5 days. Lucy spent the time visiting her rescued friends, shielded from media speculation. "What if the jury doesn't believe me?" she signed to Mrs. Chen. The reply was gentle. "You told the truth. That's all anyone can do." The verdict was unanimous. Wilde guilty on all counts, facing life without parole. Co-conspirators received 25 years to life. At sentencing, Judge Harrison said, "The testimony of your victims, particularly the 6-year-old witness, has demonstrated the depth of harm you inflicted." When Lucy learned the sentences, her shoulders finally eased. "They can't hurt anyone now," she signed. Soon, requests arrived for Lucy to speak with other victims. With careful supervision, she began helping children find their own voices. Her case set national precedent, accommodating a deaf child witness, using a therapy dog in federal court, and mounting a sweeping prosecution of an interstate trafficking ring. Shadow's role drew attention from law enforcement nationwide for its therapeutic impact. Lucy's journey, from invisible victim to powerful advocate, was complete. Her courage not only secured justice for herself and her friends, but reshaped how the justice system protects the most vulnerable. The little girl who once felt unheard had proven her voice, spoken or signed, could create safety for others, ensuring the darkness she survived would claim no more victims. Officer Sarah Bennett's decision to enroll Shadow in specialized training for work with deaf children grew from watching the bond between the German Shepherd and Lucy deepen during the long months of legal proceedings. What began as a simple connection between a traumatized child and a therapy-trained police dog revealed untapped potential for how law enforcement could serve deaf victims and witnesses. "I've been Shadow's partner for 4 years," Bennett told Captain Rodriguez when proposing the program. "He's done search and rescue, drug detection, evidence recovery, but what I've seen with Lucy and other deaf children tells me he can do more than I ever thought possible. Training for deaf child assistants required an entirely different approach. Bennett partnered with experts in deaf education, child psychology, and animal-assisted therapy. Unlike standard canine instruction focused on scent work and verbal commands, this training emphasized visual communication, emotional sensitivity, and calm, non-intrusive support. Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in therapy for special needs children, joined the team. Shadow's gifts can't be taught from scratch, Dr. Foster observed early on. He already responds precisely to hand signals, reads body language for distress, and adjusts his approach naturally for deaf children. We can refine that. In the first weeks, Shadow proved adept at reading facial expressions, posture, and even consultant, offering insights through interpreter Ms. Rodriguez. Shadow knows I'm scared before I do, Lucy signed. He makes sure I can see his face, and he waits for me to come to him. Her feedback shaped new protocols, from approach techniques to trauma-sensitive interaction. The manual they developed would later be adopted nationwide, creating an entirely new specialty in police dog work. Months later, Shadow passed certification as the first deaf child assistance police dog in the region, demonstrating skills that hadn't existed in police training 6 months earlier. At the ceremony, Bennett told the assembled crowd, he's not just the first to earn this certification, he inspired its creation. Captain Rodriguez announced plans to train more canines. Federal agencies and private foundations pledged funding. The Department of Justice even launched a grant program for other agencies. For Lucy, the bond with Shadow became the bridge to her own transformation, from silent victim to confident advocate. At 7, she began advising child protection services on improving communication with deaf children. Always use certified ASL interpreters, train staff in deaf culture, and record each child's communication preferences. When adults don't understand that we're watching their faces, they miss how we feel, she told them. She also addressed police trainees, teaching them basic signs like safe and help, and explaining how small gestures could ease a child's fear. Data showed her sessions led to better communication and reduced trauma responses. Lucy's healing was reinforced by her friendships with Maria, David, and Tommy, other rescued children. They met weekly with Dr. Hendricks, supporting each other's recoveries. Maria learned sign language. David wrote stories about brave children, and Tommy, once silent, began speaking again. Lucy thrived in a specialized school for deaf students with trauma histories, quickly becoming a peer mentor. At her adoption hearing, she signed, "Mrs. Chen saved my life in more ways than keeping me safe. She taught me my voice matters." Her growing network included law enforcement, educators, and advocates inspired by her courage. Detective Martinez, who had helped rescue her, often attended her events. Bennett and Shadow regularly joined her for presentations, combining Lucy's insights with demonstrations of Shadow's techniques. As her reputation grew, invitations poured in from conferences and policy forums. Her team ensured each opportunity supported her well-being and education. She's becoming one of the most effective advocates for deaf children's rights in the country, noted Dr. Rebecca Martinez. The Lucy Martinez Foundation for Deaf Children's Rights was born, drawing children and professionals to foundation events. Shadow shows deaf children that help can come even if you can't call for it in the usual ways, Lucy told the crowd at the launch. The Foundation's training modules covered basic ASL for emergencies, deaf culture, recognizing trauma signs, and working with interpreters. Videos featured Lucy, Shadow, and experts, demonstrating real-world scenarios. Lucy's presentation skills blossomed. She could adapt her message to police, parents, or policymakers, always authentic and moving. At the Foundation's first annual fundraiser, Lucy reunited with Maria, David, and Tommy. Maria translated for hearing guests. David read a story dedicated to Shadow. Tommy presented a special collar he'd designed. The event raised enough to expand programs to 3 more states, with national reach planned in 5 years. The DOJ committed to incorporating the training into national law enforcement programs. Lucy's closing message at events became her signature. Every deaf child deserves to be heard. We might communicate differently, but our voices are just as important. When adults learn to listen in our language, no deaf child will have to suffer in silence again. Her journey and Shadow's had reshaped law enforcement's approach to deaf children, turning trauma into a legacy of protection, communication, and hope that would endure for generations. The courthouse steps, where 6-year-old Lucy once trembled in fear, now hosted a very different gathering. A ceremony marking the first anniversary of the trial that dismantled a trafficking network and transformed how the legal system treated deaf children as witnesses. At 7, Lucy stood tall beside a bronze plaque, honoring her courage and that of all child witnesses. Sunlight lit her confident smile as Judge Harrison addressed law enforcement, advocates, media, and community members. Today, we celebrate not only justice served, but a system now better equipped to hear every child, no matter how they communicate. Lucy, once silent and terrified, now signed and spoke with steady confidence. 1 year ago, I couldn't tell adults that other children needed help. Now I know there are grown-ups who will listen and act. Over the past year, Shadow, her German Shepherd partner, had aided in 17 cases involving deaf children, helping secure 12 convictions. Officer Bennett proudly credited him with restoring trust and aiding healing. Appeals from Marcus Wilde's network had failed at every level, cementing legal precedents that courts nationwide were adopting. Maria, David, and Tommy, rescued with Lucy, were thriving. Maria, living with her grandmother in Los Angeles, had become fluent in sign language. Social services were adopting new policies for deaf children. Dr. Rebecca Martinez of the National Deaf Children's Advocacy Network called it a catalyst for systemic change. Lucy and Mrs. Chen's bond had been formally sealed through adoption. Their advocacy earned them Family of the Year honors. Dr. Hendricks noted, Lucy gained a mother who saw her as a change maker. Mrs. Chen gained a partner in protecting children. The plaque's inscription read, "In honor of Lucy Martinez and all child witnesses who find the courage to speak their truth. Their voices, in whatever language, make the world safer for all children." As the crowd dispersed, Lucy remained on the courthouse steps with Shadow, both aware they stood at the center of change that would protect children for years to come. Weeks later, the State Police Academy prepared for something unprecedented, a joint training by a 7-year-old child advocate and the nation's first certified deaf child assistance, K9. Captain Patricia Williams told 150 recruits, Lucy Martinez and K9 Officer Shadow have changed how law enforcement approaches deaf children. What you learn today will stay with you throughout your careers. Lucy entered with Mrs. Chen and Miss Rodriguez, wearing the same blue dress from her court testimony. Shadow followed Officer Bennett, his amber eyes scanning the room with gentle focus. Some deaf children you meet will be victims, some witnesses, some just needing help, Lucy signed and spoke. We communicate differently. Please learn to listen with your eyes. She demonstrated visual communication with Shadow, whose quick responses to hand signals impressed the recruits. Officer Bennett explained his ability to read body language and emotional states. Lucy showed how Shadow distinguished frantic distress from hesitant disclosure, adjusting his behavior to either urgency or patient encouragement. When I was scared, Shadow knew my signs were urgent before the adults did, Lucy shared. Her tips for officers included how deaf children rely on facial cues, judge safety from expressions, and notice whether adults truly listen. Recruits were visibly moved. Jennifer Martinez, one trainee, admitted, "I didn't realize how many children might be asking for help in ways I couldn't recognize. Lucy taught me to listen with my eyes." Officer Bennett reflected, "Shadow has shown me that police dogs can be healers and bridges to trust." Dr. Amanda Foster noted this training was becoming standard nationwide. Lucy's final words carried weight. "If you remember what Shadow and I showed you, maybe no child will have to wait as long as I did for someone to understand." The recruits responded with a standing ovation. 13 months after Lucy's testimony sparked the counties with adults or interpreters. Lucy's response was immediate. "If I can help her feel safe, we have to go right away." At the Child Advocacy Center, Emma, small, withdrawn, and traumatized, avoided eye contact. Shadow entered quietly, positioning himself within view, but not too close. Lucy signed, "Hi, Emma. I know what it's like to see scary things and not know who to trust." Emma gave the smallest nod. Lucy didn't rush. She remembered what it was like to be a frightened child, surrounded by strangers. Shadow's calm, watchful presence began to bridge the silence. The work they were about to begin would once again test and prove the power of patience, empathy, and communication without words. "Shadow helped me when I was really scared and didn't know who I could trust," Lucy signed, her movements slow and clear, so Emma could follow every gesture. "He showed me that some adults really do want to help children, and that it's safe to tell them what happened when bad adults hurt people." The breakthrough came when Emma began to sign her first tentative questions about Shadow's role and Lucy's experiences. Her signs were hesitant and fragmented, but they represented the beginning of communication that would eventually lead to her providing crucial testimony about the domestic violence incident she had witnessed. The successful application of techniques developed through Lucy's case was evident throughout the interview process. Emma responded to Lucy's peer counseling in ways that adult professionals, despite their training and good intentions, had been unable to achieve. Shadow's therapeutic presence provided the sense of safety that allowed Emma to begin sharing the traumatic information she had been carrying alone. Emma saw her foster father hit her foster mother with a metal object, Lucy translated after Emma had begun signing more freely. She's afraid that if she tells the adults what she saw, her foster father will hurt her, the way he hurt her foster mother. She thinks maybe if she doesn't tell anyone, everyone will be safer. The familiar pattern of a child protecting adults by remaining silent resonated deeply with Lucy, who recognized her own fears and misconceptions in Emma's reluctance to communicate. Her ability to explain to Emma why speaking up would actually create safety, rather than danger, proved crucial to helping the older girl understand that silence wouldn't protect anyone. The growing network of deaf child advocates, inspired by Lucy's example, had expanded to include several other children who had been helped through similar techniques. Emma's case would become the 14th successful application of the Lucy Martinez approach to working with deaf child witnesses, demonstrating that the techniques were replicable and effective across different types of cases and different children. What we're seeing is the development of a new specialty within child advocacy. Emma. Lucy's natural ability to connect with traumatized deaf children, combined with Shadow's therapeutic presence, has created an approach that consistently produces better outcomes than traditional methods. The recognition that Lucy's courage had created lasting systemic change was evident not just in Emma's successful interview, but in the fact that law enforcement agencies now had protocols and resources specifically designed for working with deaf child witnesses. The techniques that had been developed through Lucy's case were no longer experimental. They were standard practice that was saving children and solving crimes. Emma's eventual testimony, provided with Lucy's support and Shadow's comforting presence, led to the conviction of her foster father on charges of attempted murder and child endangerment. More importantly, it led to Emma's placement in a specialized foster home with deaf parents who could provide the cultural and communication environment she needed for healing. As Lucy watched Emma begin her own recovery journey, she experienced the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her suffering had prevented another child's prolonged isolation and fear. The scared 6-year-old, who had once felt invisible and unheard, had become the bridge that allowed other deaf children to find their voices and seek justice. Every time we help another deaf child tell their story, Lucy signed to Mrs. Chen as they left the advocacy center after Emma's successful interview. I understand better why I had to go through what I went through. Maybe all the scary things that happened to me were so that I could help other children not feel as alone and scared as I felt. The full circle was complete. Lucy had transformed from victim to survivor to advocate to healer. Her journey from silence to voice had created pathways that other deaf children could follow, supported by techniques and understanding that hadn't existed before her courage had created them. Shadow's gentle presence beside her, as they walked back to their car, seemed to acknowledge the completion of this transformation. The German shepherd, who had rescued her from darkness, had become her partner in bringing light to other children trapped in similar shadows. The scared little girl was gone, replaced by a confident advocate whose voice, whether expressed through sign language or spoken words, would continue to protect deaf children for years to come. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's annual award ceremony in Washington, D.C., had honored heroes from across the country for more than 20 years. But the presentation of the Outstanding Child Advocate Award to 8-year-old Lucy Martinez represented something unprecedented in the organization's history. Never before had a child so young received recognition not just for surviving trauma, but for transforming that survival into a force for protecting other children on a national scale. Lucy stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis, her small frame dignified in a navy blue dress that Mrs. Chen had chosen to match the dress she had worn during her original court testimony. The symbolism was intentional. From that first desperate attempt to communicate about Maria, David, and Tommy to this moment of national recognition, Lucy's journey represented the power of one voice to create change that rippled far beyond its original circumstances. 2 years ago, Lucy Martinez was a 6-year-old victim of human trafficking who felt invisible and unheard in a world that didn't understand how she communicated, announced NCMEC President Rebecca Walsh as she prepared to present the award. Today, she stands before us as an advocate whose courage has created new laws, new policies, and new hope for deaf children across America. Her transformation from victim to hero represents the very best of what the human spirit can accomplish. Lucy's acceptance speech, delivered through sign language and increasingly confident spoken words, carried the wisdom and maturity that had emerged from her extraordinary journey. I didn't know that speaking up about Maria, David, and Tommy would help so many other children. She signed, her words translated by Miss Rodriguez, while also being spoken in her own clear voice. I just knew that my friends needed help, and I couldn't stay quiet when I knew where they were. But I've learned that when one child finds the courage to ask for help, it makes it easier for other children to be brave too. Shadow's recognition as the first certified deaf child assistance police dog in the United States came through a special commendation from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, acknowledging his role in creating an entirely new specialization within K-9 law enforcement. The award ceremony included a demonstration of Shadow's abilities, showing how his specialized training had evolved to support not just Lucy, but dozens of other deaf children who had encountered the legal system over the past 2 years. Shadow has demonstrated that police dogs can be more than detection tools or protection assets, explained IACP President Chief Patricia Williams as she presented the award to Officer Bennett on Shadow's behalf. He has shown that our K-9 partners can be bridges to communication, healing, and justice for children whose needs have been overlooked by traditional law enforcement approaches. Officer Bennett's promotion to lieutenant and her appointment as director of the newly created Specialized Child Victim Services Unit represented recognition of her pioneering work in developing techniques that had transformed how law enforcement agencies nationwide approached cases involving deaf children and other special needs victims. Her new role included oversight of K-9 training programs, child witness protocols, and interagency coordination for complex trafficking cases.
Created a model that law enforcement agencies across the country are now implementing, announced Police Chief Michael Rodriguez during the promotion ceremony. Her leadership in this specialized field has already prevented countless children from falling through the cracks of systems that weren't designed to serve their unique needs. Mrs. Chen's pride in Lucy's accomplishments and growth was evident as she watched her daughter, no longer just legally, but emotionally and spiritually her daughter in every sense, accept recognition that reflected not just personal courage, but the systematic change that courage had created. The transformation from a frightened child clinging to a worn stuffed rabbit to a confident advocate addressing national audiences represented more than recovery. It represented the flowering of potential that trauma had tried to destroy, but could not eliminate. Lucy has taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting or moving past trauma, Mrs. Chen reflected during an interview with the Washington Post following the award ceremony. Healing means transforming that trauma into something that creates safety and hope for others. Lucy hasn't just survived her experiences, she has used them to build a better world for deaf children everywhere. Media coverage of Lucy's national recognition highlighted the long-term impact of her bravery in terms that extended far beyond individual cases or local policy changes. National news networks, magazines, and online platforms documented how one child's decision to break her silence had created ripple effects that were still expanding 2 years later. Lucy Martinez has become more than a survivor or even an advocate, wrote journalist Sarah Kim in her Time magazine cover story titled The Voice of Silence. She has become a catalyst for systemic change that is protecting deaf children in contexts that have nothing to do with her original case. Her courage has rewritten how America approaches the intersection of disability rights, child protection, and criminal justice. Legislative changes inspired by Lucy's case had been enacted at both state and federal levels, creating new requirements for ASL interpreter services in legal proceedings involving deaf children, mandatory training for law enforcement officers on communication with special needs populations, and enhanced funding for specialized K-9 programs designed to work with traumatized children. The Americans with Disabilities Act amendments of 2023, informally known as the Lucy Martinez Act, specifically addressed the communication needs of deaf children in legal proceedings, healthcare settings, educational institutions, and social service agencies. The legislation ensured that Lucy's experience of being unheard and misunderstood would be far less likely to happen to other deaf children in the future. Lucy's case demonstrated that our existing systems were failing deaf children in ways we hadn't fully recognized, explained Senator Patricia Williams, who had sponsored the federal legislation. Her courage didn't just expose one trafficking network. It exposed systemic weaknesses in how we protect and serve all children with communication differences. The ripple effect of one child's courage creating national policy change represented something unprecedented in the history of child advocacy. Lucy's transformation from victim to catalyst had demonstrated that age, disability, and trauma circumstances need not limit an individual's potential to create positive change on a massive scale. As Lucy concluded her acceptance speech at the National Awards ceremony, her final words captured the essence of what her journey had accomplished. I want every deaf child in America to know that your voice matters, whether you use your hands to speak, or your mouth to speak, or any other way of communication. There are adults who will listen to you and believe you and act to keep you safe. You don't have to stay silent, and you don't have to feel alone. The standing ovation that followed her remarks came from an audience that included senators, police chiefs, child advocates, and trauma survivors who recognized that they were witnessing something remarkable, the completion of a transformation that had changed not just one child's life, but the landscape of child protection in America. The documentary, Silent No More, the Lucy Martinez story, had been in production for 18 months, with filmmaker David Chen, no relation to Lucy's adoptive mother, following Lucy, Shadow, and the extended network of professionals whose lives had been changed by their pioneering work in deaf child advocacy. What had begun as a simple story about a rescue operation had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how one child's courage could transform entire systems of law enforcement, child protection, and disability rights. The production process had required unprecedented coordination between the documentary team, Lucy's support network, and the various agencies that had been involved in her case. Every aspect of filming had been designed to protect Lucy's ongoing healing and normal childhood development, while also capturing the magnitude of change that had emerged from her initial decision to break her silence. This documentary represents more than just Lucy's individual story, explained producer Sarah Walsh during pre-production planning sessions. It's the story of how trauma can be transformed into triumph, how disability can become a source of strength, and how one voice, even a voice that communicates without sound, can change the world for thousands of other children. The interviews with all the major participants in Lucy's story provided perspectives that revealed the case's complexity and far-reaching impact. Judge Harrison reflected on how Lucy's testimony had challenged his understanding of courtroom procedures and led to innovations that were now being implemented.
Federal courts nationwide. Detective Martinez described how working with Lucy had fundamentally changed his approach to investigating crimes against children, particularly those involving victims with special communication needs. Maria, David, and Tommy's participation in the documentary, now ages 9, 10, and 7 respectively, provided powerful testimony about their shared experiences and individual healing journeys. Each child had developed their own advocacy focus. Maria worked with Spanish-speaking families, navigating services for deaf children. David continued writing children's books
about safety and courage. And Tommy, though still dealing with the effects of his severe trauma, had begun working with therapy dogs to help other young children feel safe in medical and legal settings. We all learned that staying silent doesn't protect anyone, David explained during his documentary interview, his 10-year-old voice carrying wisdom that shouldn't have been necessary, but had become invaluable to other children. Lucy taught us that speaking up, whether with signs or words or pictures or any way we can communicate, is how we keep other children safe. Shadow's starring role in the documentary included extensive footage of his specialized training techniques and his work with various deaf children who had encountered the legal system over the past 2 years. The film captured his gentle approach, his sophisticated understanding of visual communication cues, and his remarkable ability to provide therapeutic support to children who had learned to distrust adult humans but could still connect with his honest, protective presence. The documentary's educational component was designed to help viewers understand deaf children's experiences in ways that went beyond Lucy's specific case. Expert interviews with deaf education specialists, child psychologists, and disability rights advocates provided context that would help audience members recognize and respond to deaf children's needs in their own communities. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the National Deaf Children's Advocacy Network provided historical perspective that showed how Lucy's case represented a breakthrough in long-standing issues. Deaf children have been marginalized and overlooked in legal proceedings for decades, not because of malicious intent, but because systems weren't designed with their communication needs in mind. Lucy's courage has forced us to redesign those systems from the ground up. Lucy's comfort and skill in front of cameras during the documentary filming demonstrated her complete transformation from the terrified child who had first appeared in court 2 years earlier. Her interviews were articulate, thoughtful, and emotionally powerful. Documentary interviews, her words delivered through both sign language and confident spoken communication. But I remember exactly how she felt, and that's why I work so hard to help other deaf children know that they have voices that matter, and adults who will listen. The documentary premiere, held simultaneously in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Lucy's hometown, brought together virtually everyone who had played a role in her remarkable journey. The red carpet events included not just entertainment industry figures, but law enforcement officers, child advocates, legal professionals, and trauma survivors who had been inspired by Lucy's transformation. Judge Harrison attended the premiere with his wife, reflecting on how presiding over Lucy's case had become one of the most meaningful experiences of his 30-year judicial career. "Lucy taught me that justice isn't just about applying laws correctly," he said during the premiere interviews. "It's about creating conditions where truth can emerge, regardless of how that truth needs to be communicated." Mrs. Chen, elegant in a dress that complemented Lucy's premiere outfit, watched her daughter handle media interviews with a combination of pride and amazement. 2 years ago, Lucy was afraid to communicate with anyone, except through sign language with certified interpreters, she marveled during her own interviews. Tonight, she's teaching the world about courage, resilience, and the power of one voice to create change. Plans for the documentary to be used in law enforcement training programs had already been finalized before the premiere, with the Department of Justice announcing that Silent No More would become required viewing for federal agents working with child victims. State and local law enforcement agencies had also committed to incorporating the film into their training curricula. This documentary will reach officers who may never have the opportunity
to work directly with Lucy or Shadow, explained FBI Training Director Agent Patricia Williams. But they'll learn the techniques and approaches that can help them better serve deaf children and other special needs victims in their own communities. The educational impact of the documentary extended beyond law enforcement to include healthcare providers, educators, social service workers, and community organizations. The film's distribution plan included screenings at medical schools, education conferences, and social work training programs, ensuring that Lucy's insights would reach professionals across multiple fields who might encounter deaf children in crisis situations. As the premiere concluded and the credits rolled, the audience gave a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But the most powerful moment came when Lucy took the stage for final remarks, her presence commanding the attention of everyone present, despite her small stature and young age. "This movie isn't really about me," Lucy signed and spoke, her words carrying across the silent auditorium. "It's about every child who has ever felt scared and alone. Every child who has ever tried to ask for help but didn't know how to make adults understand. If this movie helps one child feel less alone, if it helps one adult learn to listen better, then everything that happened to me and my friends will have been worth it." The documentary had captured not just Lucy's individual story, but the transformation of an entire system. Her legacy was no longer just personal triumph, but institutional change that would protect children she would never meet for generations to come. At 8 years old, Lucy Martinez had accomplished more in the realm of child advocacy than most adults achieve in lifetime careers. But her plans for the future reflected a remarkable balance between continuing her important work and living the normal childhood that trauma had initially stolen from her. Standing in the backyard of the home she shared with Mrs. Chen, now officially and emotionally her mother in every sense, Lucy signed her thoughts about what lay ahead, while Shadow lounged contentedly in the afternoon sunshine, his amber eyes peaceful with the satisfaction of work well done. "I want to keep helping deaf children who are scared or hurt," Lucy signed, her movements now as natural and confident as breathing. "But I also want to do normal kid things like learn to play soccer and maybe take art classes and have sleepovers with friends who aren't famous like me." Her balance between advocacy and childhood represented the healthy integration that her therapeutic team had worked so hard to achieve. A child who could use her experiences to help others without being defined entirely by those experiences. Lucy's advocacy schedule had been carefully structured to ensure that her work remained meaningful without overwhelming her normal development. She continued to consult with law enforcement agencies on cases involving deaf child witnesses, participated in selected speaking engagements at conferences and training sessions, and maintained her role as a spokesperson for the Lucy Martinez Foundation. But all of these activities were balanced with school, friendship, family time, and the ordinary pursuits of childhood. The most remarkable thing about Lucy is how she's learned to be both an extraordinary advocate and a normal 8-year-old girl, observed Dr. Hendricks during one of their regular check-ins. She can address a room full of police chiefs about communication protocols in the morning and spend the afternoon building blanket forts and giggling with her friends. That balance is crucial to her continued healing and development. Shadow's ongoing work had expanded far beyond his original partnership with Lucy to include a comprehensive program that was now being replicated in police departments across the country, while also serving as a training model for other dogs being certified in the specialized techniques he had pioneered. Officer Bennett, now Lieutenant Bennett,
oversaw a specialized unit that included 4 additional K-9 teams, trained in deaf child assistance techniques. The program's success had attracted federal funding and international attention, with delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia visiting to observe training methods that could be adapted for their own law enforcement agencies. Shadow has essentially created a new field within police work, Lieutenant Bennett explained during an interview with Police magazine. He didn't just learn to work with deaf children. He helped us understand that all of our K-9 partners have therapeutic capabilities that we weren't fully utilizing. His work has influenced how we train dogs for all types of victim assistance, not just cases involving deaf children. The Lucy Martinez Foundation's growing impact on deaf children's rights had expanded to include programs in 37 states, with plans for national coverage within the next 2 years. The Foundation's work now included not just law enforcement training, but also educational programs for healthcare providers, advocacy training for parents of deaf children, and support services for deaf children who had experienced trauma. Foundation Director Dr. Amanda Foster reported remarkable success in measurable outcomes. We've documented significant improvements in how deaf children are served by police, courts, hospitals, and social service agencies in communities where our training programs have been implemented. Lucy's insights have been transformed into practical protocols that are creating safer, more accessible environments for deaf children nationwide. Maria, David, and Tommy's continued healing and their own advocacy efforts had become inspiring examples of how shared trauma could be transformed into collaborative healing. Each child had found their own path toward using their experiences to help others, while also rebuilding the normal childhood experiences that trafficking had interrupted. Maria, now 9 and thriving with her grandmother in Los Angeles, had become fluent in ASL and served as a peer counselor for other Spanish-speaking families navigating services for deaf children. Her bilingual and bicultural skills made her invaluable in helping bridge communication gaps that had previously left many families without adequate support. David, at 10 years old, had published 3 children's books about safety, courage, and asking for help, with proceeds donated to organizations serving child trafficking survivors. His trauma he had experienced, but had made remarkable progress in his recovery. His work with therapy dogs had evolved into a formal program where he helped other young children feel comfortable with animal-assisted therapy, drawing on his positive experiences with Shadow to help other traumatized children accept comfort and support. Mrs. Chen and Lucy's family life exemplified the successful balance between advocacy work and normal family activities that had been crucial to Lucy's healthy development. Their home life included ordinary routines like homework help, family dinners, weekend outings, and the comfortable rhythms of a mother and daughter who had chosen each other and built a relationship based on love, trust, and shared values. Lucy is my daughter first, and an advocate second, Mrs. Chen explained during a family interview for Better Homes and Gardens magazine. We make sure that her identity is grounded in being loved and valued for who she is as a person, not just for what she has accomplished. Her advocacy work flows from that secure foundation, not the other way around. The family's evening routine often included Lucy practicing her presentation skills, with Mrs. Chen serving as both supportive audience and gentle critic. But it also included typical activities like board games, movie nights, and bedtime stories. The balance ensured that Lucy's extraordinary public role never overshadowed her need for ordinary family experiences. Lucy's message of hope for other children who might be suffering in silence had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how individual courage could create collective change. Her presentations now addressed not just the immediate needs of deaf children, but the broader principles of advocacy, resilience, and the power of speaking truth in whatever language felt most authentic. Every child has something important to say, Lucy would tell audiences, her words delivered through both sign language and increasingly confident speech. Sometimes, what we have to say is scary, or difficult, or something adults don't want to hear. But if we find the courage to keep trying to communicate, if we don't give up on finding someone who will listen, then our voices can change the world for other children who are still scared and silent. The story's conclusion emphasized the fundamental truth that had emerged from Lucy's journey. One voice, even a voice that communicated without sound, could indeed change the world. Her transformation from victim to survivor, to advocate, had demonstrated that age, disability, and traumatic circumstances need not limit an individual's potential to create positive change that rippled far beyond their original situation. As Lucy looked toward the future, toward high school, college, through systems and policies and trained professionals whose effectiveness had been enhanced by her willingness to break her silence. The scared little girl, who had once felt invisible in a world that didn't understand sign language, had become a voice for all children who needed someone to listen, to believe, to act on their behalf. Her legacy was written not just in the lives she had directly touched, but in the laws she had inspired, the policies she had shaped, the professionals she had trained, and the countless future children who would be safer because one small girl had found the courage to say, through her hands and her heart, "Help me, help us, help them." In the end, Lucy Martinez's story was not just about surviving trauma or overcoming disability or even about rescuing other children, though it was all of those things. It was about the fundamental power of truth-telling, the extraordinary potential that exists within ordinary individuals, and the way that one voice, raised in courage, supported by love, and amplified by justice, can indeed change the world. Lucy's story reminds us of something beautiful and timeless, the incredible bond between children and animals, and how a loyal German shepherd like Shadow can become so much more than a working dog. He became a bridge to healing, a source of comfort when human words weren't enough, and living proof that animals understand our hearts in ways that often surpass our own understanding. There's something sacred about the relationship between humans and dogs, isn't there? Shadow didn't just follow his training, he followed his instincts to protect and comfort. He saw Lucy's pain and responded with the kind of unwavering loyalty that German shepherds are known for. That gentle strength, that intuitive understanding, it's what makes our dogs such treasures in our lives. If you have a dog who's touched your heart the way Shadow touched Lucy's, you know that connection is precious. Sometimes we wish we could understand our own companions even better, communicate with them more deeply. If that resonates with you, there's a wonderful resource I've come across that might help you strengthen that bond with your own four-legged friend. Would love to know, what's your dog's name?